Hi, I'm Ben and welcome to my book corner. Today we're looking at All That's Left in the World, a young adult novel released in March of 2022, written by Eric J. Brown. We're going to jump straight in with the story. We're going to touch on the characters. We're going to talk a little bit about the world building and the goings on in the world, and we're going to end with positives, negatives, and my final thoughts. So let's just jump in. So the story is set in post-pandemic America. Specifically, the pandemic that occurred on this occasion is a bird flu pandemic that transferred to humans and wiped out a massive proportion of the population. The story follows Jamie and Andrew. They meet right at the beginning of the story when Andrew is basically scavenging for supplies following an injury that he sustained whilst travelling south. He goes into a cabin which just happens to be Jamie's. Jamie ends up nursing him back to health. However, multiple things occur that makes the cabin unsafe, and Andrew decides to leave the cabin and carry on his journey on his own, not wanting to put his new friend in danger. Jamie, however, realising he's not as healed as he wants to be, goes after him, also not feeling safe, and they decide to work together to reach Reagan International Airport, where apparently the EU is coming to help save the survivors. And what has occurred right from the beginning of this story is a growing bond between the two characters, through to almost a romantic attachment, which by the end they're shown as a couple by the end of the book. It's also a road trip through the post-apocalypse of America, and you're seeing how run down and how battered the actual place now is after it's been pretty much abandoned of life, and the side effects of what happens with the small communities that form, and how in some cases they're quite unsavoury and extreme, but it also has various themes of hope and how sometimes you should actually give people a chance. So this is actually a really sweet book, and it's a decent story to kick off with. But of course, no story is complete without its characters, and this book is told from the point of view of the two characters, Jamie and Andrew. The way the book is structured is that it alternates in chapters from one point of view and then to the other. So what you do end up with a little bit here at times is some quite short chapters, but whereas normally this is a deal breaker for me, this actually works because quite often it's two chapters telling the same story, just from a different point of view. So for once, that's actually not a deal breaker, and to be fair, the chapters aren't exactly short as they are in some other books. Cough cough the troop. So you have the two main leads. Andrew is portrayed as a short, wisecracking, gay, liberal arts student is the sort of impression you get. That you get the impression that his family were quite strict and were not massive fans of some of his life choices. And then you have Jamie, who seems to have had a more holistic upbringing by his single mum, who was a nurse, and in her dying days she passed on as much knowledge as she could to him, so that if the worst ever occurred, he'd know how to deal with things. And what's really nice here is that although really the characters aren't that deep, but they're written so charmingly, and their interactions with each other are so natural that it sort of draws you in and you end up rooting for them. The other thing as well is that right at the start of the book, Andrew sort of laments the fact that just his luck to find a good looking boy that's straight with no sense of humour, and over the course of the story he becomes uncomfortable with some of the feelings he begins to develop. On the flip side, Jamie, who's only ever had girlfriends, begins to wonder what these feelings he's getting for Andrew is. And there's actually a point in the book where it's actually addressed. It's like, can you be bi and not realise it? And there's an interesting character growth as Jamie comes to terms with more of himself than he perhaps realised was there before. And it's actually really sweet when they finally sort of take the plunge in a point of where everything's just going horribly wrong, basically. And just after that, there is a massive gut punch as well. There are a few other characters in this. Most of them aren't around very long. There's kind of two main characters that you meet without to spoil anything. One is an old woman within the ruins of Bethesda, who links into kind of the ending of the story, who gives the thing of maybe don't turn your back on everyone and give some people a chance. And that is followed on later on with a young lady they meet in one of the settlements they end up in. But like I say, the characters, whilst they're not overly deep, they both have a character arc. Jamie in particular, as he comes to terms with the fact that he's bi and not straight, and what that means in terms of him and his relationship with Andrew specifically, in the world in general. But characters are really, really, really sweet and pretty well done. So a lot of the world building in general is standard fare, but there's a few little standouts in here. The first thing is there is a level of political commentary here, which, as we've not long since, well, we haven't really come out of COVID, if we're completely honest with it. It's still around, we just don't talk about it anymore. But there's a observation of how governments dealt with this, and it's mentioned that in America, within this setting, they focused on trying to drive the economy and keep the money flowing, and that didn't really put the needs of the people first until it was too late and the government kind of collapsed in on itself. And it also referenced Europe, who were a bit more strict on lockdowns, and the UK even, where apparently you were shot on site for breaking curfews. So the very, very sort of swing to authoritarianism that you sort of saw during the pandemic is referenced here. And the other thing as well is what happens when society collapses, or what sort of groups kind of take over. And quite often, unfortunately, you do see in a lot of post-apocalypse, and you hope it's not true, that sort of more extremes tend to do better and survive better. There are examples in here of some far-right white supremacists that sort of form up and try and form a bit of a government, for want of a better word, like a large settlement, but it feels askew to how the world was before, and especially for the two main characters, is not a place where they actually want to be because of their sexuality. It's actually touched on that in this place, once there's no one over a certain age, because at that point you're just not worth the resources. Got some nice little tidbits as well when you're walking through the towns of how deserted they are. One thing I really like, which is in contrast to the picture behind me, is they're talking about whenever you think of post-apocalypse, you're thinking of, you know, massive traffic jams of abandoned cars on motorways. But because this was a pandemic rather than a natural disaster, it eventually hit a point where people just didn't want to go out, so the roads are pretty much deserted of cars. You get the odd one, obviously, but it's a very almost an airy and empty sort of feeling, and that's actually pretty well done. Also, the fact they're talking about how rare the medicines are and sort of things that were left behind after lootings occurred is also pretty solid. Past that, the world building isn't that deep. There is some basic descriptive work on what the places look like and what they feel like and what they sound like, but there's not a huge amount there. They do touch on a few dates from key points, like, for example, when TVs went off, when power grids shut down, stuff like that. But obviously at this point, sort of time has become a bit more fluid and people lose track of it when there's no routine to help keep you seated, so to speak. I also do quite like the way that, especially at the end, there's like a hopeful note for how society could be where they reach their final destination as well. There's some twists and turns in here as well to do with the EU rescue and stuff like that. So again, pretty solid. So, on to the strengths and the weaknesses of this novel. So, I'm going to start with the negatives because there isn't really that many of them. The first thing is, whilst the characters are well written, they do lack a little bit of depth. Now, overall, that's not a major detriment to the story because I'll touch on that in the positives, but it is something to bear in mind. The other thing as well is the actual world building in terms of some of the physicality is a little bit lacking here and there due to how tightly focused it is on the characters. Normally that's not a major issue, but it is something to bear in mind. There are other post-apocalyptic books out there that have done a better job. Now that being said, what is here is good. Now in terms of positives, the relationship and the character arcs of Jamie and Andrew are actually really well done, and there's this really sweet dynamic between the two, especially as you have kind of the more extroverted, cocky, loudmouth, brash character, and then you have the sort of calm, gentle, kind character, which is in a lot of these sorts of stories. It's quite cliche in many ways, but it's still very well done here. And they do have natural character development, especially Jamie, in terms of his sexuality, and that his place in the world being sort of turned upside down is pretty well done. The time you get with some of the supporting cast is well done as well, although again they are not as fleshed out as ideally you would have liked them to be, but this isn't an especially long book, so that's to be expected. The social commentary is also pretty well done here, looking at how ineffective governments were during the COVID outbreak. This was obviously written during COVID outbreak, and a lot of the sort of themes in here are inspired by the apparent radicalisation that occurred during that. A lot of places seem to lurch quite strongly towards a more authoritarian right-wing approach, and that is reflected in some of the views that you see in this book by some of the characters. And the other positive as well is there's a natural sort of thread of hope running front to back of this, and actually maybe the world won't be that bad, and maybe not everyone is horrible, and you might just find someone that you can rely on. And that is something that's touched on several times through the book, and is eventually reinforced at the end when they reach their final destination, which, spoiler alert, is not the airport where the EU is coming to, because they don't come. But you see that there is some hope at the end of the tunnel, and it doesn't matter how dark everything is. And I think that's something that at times we sometimes forget, especially at the moment where everything in the world seems to be on fire. So it's quite a hopeful story. And the story of like this growing relationship between the two lads in here is actually quite heartwarming and heartfelt. And I think that's what's the greatest thing about this book. It's got a great deal of heart to it. Now with all that being said, for me this is a high B tier. It doesn't quite fall into an A tier for me, simply because whilst they are well written, the two characters are not as deep as I would like, especially with the singular focus on them. And there is a little bit of world building lacking there for me personally, but I can easily recommend this for anyone who just wants a nice, easy and heartfelt, heartwarming book to read. But that is of course my opinions on this. I would love to know yours. Have you read it? What do you think about it? Let me know in the comments below, and I will catch you all next time.